From the Alvin and Rosalie Sarachek studio, PBS Kansas presents Kansas Week.
And the search is on for a third Cedric County election commissioner in just over a year. Plus, the Kansas House picks new leadership. What does that mean for the legislative agenda? And a year after the tragic loss of a Cedric County teen in custody, new rules for when police can use force and restraints. That's what we're talking about right now on Kansas Week. I'm Pilar Pedraza, and this is Kansas Week. Cedric Lofton died while in custody last year at the Juvenile Intake Center. The coroner labeled his death a homicide, but the DA said he couldn't press charges against the officers who pinned Lofton down until he died. But now the county has adopted new use of force and restraint policies, suggestions from a public task force. Cake's Jackson Overstreet explains.
Across the street from Cedric County's Juvenile Intake Center sits a makeshift shrine to Cedric Lofton.
But if there's anything that we learned from CJ Lofton's murder is that our communities, our corrections community, our public safety community could really do a lot more to challenge themselves to see what can they do differently.
Lofton died in September 2021 after being injured while being restrained in custody at JIAC. Wednesday, the Cedric County Commission approved changes to JIAC policy on use of force and restraints.
These are technical fixes.
The new policy requires a more transparent reporting process when staff needs to restrain someone and creates a third-party observer to watch when restraints are being used to make sure someone is not being held down too long. All the changes are recommendations from the Lofton Task Force.
I think it is a great step in the right direction.
However, this new policy did face some criticism. One issue is that the county will still use the prone position while restraining someone.
We feel like there's enough clear evidence that the prone position has caused enough harm and enough deaths.
Commissioner Lacey Cruz also pushing back, saying the changes today aren't going far enough.
I mean, I'm glad we're making movement. I will say that policy change is not justice for the child who died, CJ Lofton.
County correction officials say they understand the complaints, but today is just another step in the process of fixing what went wrong with Lofton. It does not signal that they are done.
The system working together are issues that we still have to work on. So we're still taking steps towards that.
And here to dive deeper into this topic and others today, we have by Zoom Brad Cooper with the Sunflower State Journal. And here on the desk with me, we have Dr. Neil Allen, Wichita State University political analyst, and Melody McCrae Miller, a former state legislator and also now with Wichita State University. And Melody, I'm going to start with you because I believe you said you also served on the criminal justice reform committees when you were in the legislature. And this restraint and the lying prone issue is something that it sounds like is going to go to state lawmakers as opposed to being dealt with locally.
Excellent. The reason why I'm saying excellent is because I do believe that it did need to take the next step and move to a policy setting where it can get what I would call legal eyes on, not from Cedric County, but instead from a public state policy perspective. I believe that justice probably was not done in this case, Pilar. I know that they are taking steps in the right direction. However, they are continuing to maintain that prone position, that it's legal to do that. 30 minutes on the ground with an individual that prior to coming to the detention facility, they knew that this individual had some issues, sociological and emotional, that was causing them to see things. Those were just some of what was detailed. And that tells me that there was probably an emotional issue that was going on that could have been dealt with from a psychological perspective, mental health. But instead, they, if I understand correctly, changed the form to say, no, this person does not need mental health services. Instead, we're taking this person to JIAC. And that's when, the aggressive behavior continued and that prone position was allowed to be held for 30 minutes. And 10 minutes is too long. 30 minutes allowing the person to start to cough and to choke, a nosebleed, should be signals to an officer to say enough is enough, we need to let this child up.
And trying to get change through the state legislature when you're talking about criminal justice reform is not always the easiest path.
It's not always the easiest path, Pilar, because it's not always prioritized. When you look at juveniles, some, depending upon the setting that you find yourself in, if it's a county, if it's a state policymaker, some persons want to treat them as adults, and we know that the data shows that these young people are not that, and so therefore they should be treated differently. So I think that the difficulties come in how it is that the policymakers are assessing the person and the situation, and that brings us to where we are today.
And we have seen a change in leadership in the Kansas House this week because we have a whole new state house, not state house, but state house, two separate words. And so Kansas House is going to look a little bit different when they go back to work in January. Will that show up in what they do? Well, among other changes, both Republicans and Democrats elected a slate of new leaders this week. Let's go to Rebecca Chung from the KSN Capitol Bureau for more.
Two veteran lawmakers have been picked to lead both parties in the Kansas House. Republicans named Dan Hawkins from Wichita as the next Kansas House Speaker, and Democrats chose Vic Miller from Topeka as the next House Minority Leader. Next year's legislative session will kick off with new faces and new leaders in the Kansas House. In a unanimous vote, Representative Dan Hawkins, a Republican from Wichita, was elected the next Kansas House Speaker. Hawkins, who served in the House since 2013, will take retiring Speaker Ron Reichman's place.
Our folks have a lot of things that they want to get done. We want some tax relief yet. We certainly have some things to do on education. To say that there's not going to be any other abortion bills is wrong. You know, everybody's free to bring whatever they want when it comes to bills. So we'll see those.
Democrats also have items that are high on their priority list. Representative Vic Miller from Topeka will lead the charge as House Minority Leader.
Most people have heard about these things before. They remain top of the list. Immediately repealing the sales tax exemption on food.
Miller, who served 10 years in the legislature, faced off with Representative Brandon Woodard, one of the first LGBTQ lawmakers in the Kansas House. In the end, Democrats voted 21-19 to elect Miller to the spot. Miller will be taking Representative Tom Sawyer's place as Minority Leader.
I'm not saying that we're going to agree on everything, which we won't. Fundamentally, we're quite a ways apart, but that doesn't mean that we can't sit down and talk.
I think a lot can be done when people work together, even when they have opposing views.
Now, Republicans are clinging on to their supermajority here in the House. Democrats picked up a few seats, but not enough to shift the power dynamic here. They'll be back to kick off next year's session on January 9th. For now, reporting at the Capitol, I'm Rebecca Chung.
So, Brad, let's start with you up there in Northeast Kansas, covering this at the State House on a regular basis. As we look at these new leadership positions, what does that tell us about what we can expect out of this coming session?
Pilar, I don't think that we're going to see a terribly different shift or direction from what we've seen the last 6 years with Ron Reichman Jr. as the House Speaker. Dan Hawkins is obviously a conservative from Wichita. What I think was most notable this week, besides his election, was that the new Speaker-elect appointed committee chairs this year, or just appointed committee chairs this week. And I think a lot of people had expected, or there was some anticipation that maybe the new speaker might make wholesale changes in the committee leadership. He did not. You're going to see many of the same faces that were leading committees the past 4 or 6 years that are going to still be there under new Speaker Hawkins. Troy Waymaster from Bunker Hill will still be chair of the Appropriations Committee in the House. Brenda Landwehr will still be chair of the House Health Committee. And most of the changes that the new speaker made were largely filling spaces that came open with either retirements or election losses. I mean, one notable change we'll see is on the House Federal and State Affairs Committee, where John Barker was defeated last year to another conservative Republican. He will be replaced as the chair on that committee by Representative Will Carpenter. But the changes the speaker made are largely fairly nominal. He didn't really make drastic changes. I think where the biggest change and the biggest election came was in the election for the new House Majority Leader, which featured a battle between basically two Johnson County Republicans, Chris Croft and Sean Tarwater. And in that case, you sort of had Chris Croft, who he chairs the Republican House Campaign Committee, or PAC, who raised more than $1 million over the course of two years. And he was going up against Sean Tarwater, who chaired the Commerce Committee and will continue to chair the Commerce Committee. And Representative Tarwater had been a particularly outspoken critic of how the Kelly administration had handled the Labor Department during the pandemic. And I think that the knock on Croft going into the election was that I think there was an expectation by some House members that the House would grow its numbers, especially given the fact that they had so much money at their disposal to spend. The House ended up losing one seat. They still have a supermajority. And so I think there are some questions with Representative Croft as to, how much or if the House caucus should have grown. But nevertheless, the change of the makeup of the leadership of the House really doesn't change. Dan Hawkins obviously had been the majority leader. Chris Croft will be. They're basically both conservative guys. That's not going to change the inflection of the chamber as a whole. It's worth noting, I think, as an aside, as a point of trivia, that Representative Blake Carpenter of Derby became one of the youngest elected leaders to be House Speaker pro tem. He's tied with two other former lawmakers, one from 1875 and another from 1911, that were 31 years old when they were elected to that position. The only other person to hold that position that's been younger is former state representative Jim Slattery, who was 29 when he was elected to that. And so that's just a trivia aside for those who keep track of such things.
All right. And Neil, you had a thought on this?
Well, also, it's interesting to talk about Blake Carpenter, and just just to disclose, he happened to be actually a somewhat recent graduate of Wichita State University, and actually won his seat while a student at the time. And Representative Blake Carpenter being in leadership shows one interesting difference between the two parties right now. So on the Republican side, they have more people in leadership because they're in the majority, but they are a mix of people from different parts of the state. And they're continuing the norm of usually alternating the speaker between Northeast Kansas and somewhere else. On the Democratic side, everyone is from Northeast Kansas by my read. There's no one from Western Kansas, but then of course the Democrats aren't electing anybody from Western Kansas anymore. But also there's nobody from South Central Kansas either, from the Wichita area. And so it really follows where the state is going, where the Democrats are becoming the dominant party in Northeast Kansas. And they're a strong minority party, but their voters are concentrated in one part of the state.
Although we do have to keep in mind that the last two House Minority Leaders were from Wichita, and the assistant House Minority Leader last session was from Hutchinson. So
yeah, but there's a shift on the Democratic side where we've had a Wichita leader for the last two leaders, and that in some ways was anomalous considering the fact that the caucus really is strongest in Northeast Kansas, particularly Johnson County.
Okay. Well, one thing we know is likely to be up for debate again this year is reproductive rights. After Kansans voted down an amendment on abortion maintaining the status quo on current regulations, conservative lawmakers say they fully expect anti-abortion bills to surface this session. Let's go back to Rebecca Chung for more.
The new speaker here in the Kansas House says he can't stop abortion bills from being introduced, but with the majority of Kansans voting to uphold abortion rights, it will be up to Republican leaders to decide whether that legislation should move forward. Several hot-button issues will be up for debate in the Kansas State House next year. But when it comes to abortion, Republicans and Democrats may clash.
To say that there's not going to be any other abortion bills is wrong. You know, everybody's free to bring whatever they want when it comes to bills. So we'll see those.
I think he's not in touch with what the people just voted on August the 2nd.
Abortion could be a divisive issue for lawmakers, but the majority of Kansans made it clear where they stand. In August, almost 60% voted to uphold abortion rights.
The message I got was that the vast majority of Kansans don't want us monkeying with our current abortion laws.
Political analyst Bob Beatty says it will be up to Republican leadership to decide how to address abortion legislation that comes up next year.
The big question will be, how much does Republican leadership want to put it up for an actual vote of the entire House or the entire Senate?
Beatty says there's the possibility of a disconnect between the opinion of Republican leadership and the state as a whole. He says leadership appears to lean more conservative, even though polls show that voters appear to be leaning more purple than red.
Does Republican leadership just put their head down and just trot down the conservative path, or how much are they open to looking at some issues given the data we have from the 2022 election?
And Beatty says another one of those issues include medical marijuana. Lawmakers are working on a bill to legalize medical marijuana, and our polls show that more than 60% of Kansas voters would support it. We'll have to wait until next year to see if lawmakers take action. For now, reporting at the Capitol, I'm Rebecca Chung.
And Melody, as we look at that, at least my takeaway from what we heard from Dan Hawkins a little bit earlier is that he at least doesn't seem to be pursuing abortion regulations, but he fully expects them to come up. If leadership isn't pursuing it, what are the chances of something happening?
Neil, and I say the reason why is because the people have spoken, and the majority of the House is going to be looking at, and we are talking about the House, is going to be looking at their districts, and just as was reported, they're more purple than they are red. And I don't think they want to go out, I don't think they want to be on public notice that they're supporting overturning what the public has already spoken on. So I think it's next to nil if it's not being pushed and or supported by the speaker. It's going to be difficult.
Yeah, and one issue we do have is we do still have the supermajority Republicans in the House and the Senate, really, but a Democrat in the governor's office, and that sets up a veto situation.
It definitely does, and it'll be interesting to see what kind of legislation that the House and the Senate put forward. The Senate got to coast a little bit in the last 2 years because they weren't up for re-election like their House compatriots were. And also, I mean, Governor Kelly has taken some pretty strong stands on issues, even involving maybe opening up the way sports gambling is treated in the state legislature, which seems to have gone nowhere fast. But I would be interesting to see what Brad has to say about this up from the perspective of on the ground in Topeka, because as Representative Miller, or former Representative Miller, knows, that often, you know, what you see on television gives you the high-level view, but really what matters is vote counting and the building of coalitions in the extremely fast couple months of the legislative session.
Well, Brad, what do you think?
Well, I think at the end of the day, I think everybody's cognizant, even the folks who oppose abortion and the folks who are supportive of abortion rights. I think everybody knows that in the backdrop of all of this is the Hodes case, which the state of Kansas just voted on, and the state decided it didn't want to amend the Constitution. So anything that the legislature passes is going to probably be subject to some kind of, likely some kind of court case. Remember, it's a lot harder. The obstacles now to passing any kind of abortion restriction are much harder now than they were pre-2019, because now not only do you need a compelling state interest to pass a new restriction, it also has to be narrowly tailored to meet that compelling interest. And so it's a lot harder. There's, so far, Kansans for Life has been largely guarded in terms of what it wants to, in terms of talking about its legislative agenda. There's been some scant talk of increasing money for pregnancy crisis centers. And there's been some, I would almost argue gossipy that there might be a 15-week ban on abortion. But I think a lot of that is just speculation. I don't think that we've really, even Representative Hawkins in the interview you just aired kind of left it open as to what kind of abortion restrictions might be proposed. That it's obviously Representative Miller's been in the legislature. She knows very well that anybody can bring a bill to do anything at any time or can amend a piece of legislation. But I think, you do have you're doing all of this in the backdrop now. And to Representative Miller's point, that in the primary, the constitutional amendment only won in 35 out of 90 districts, and in House districts. And while I'm always hesitant to suggest that a vote on an amendment is the same as a candidate, because I think you look at candidates very differently than you look at a single issue. I think there were some small examples or isolated examples in the general election where that issue came home to play. The ACLU had a 527 group that was running campaign ads on abortion in some select districts in Johnson County that in those districts inevitably flipped from Republican to Democrat. And while I would be hesitant to say that was all abortion, the ACLU certainly did campaign on that issue and spent money on mailers that went into that district. And in those cases, those districts flipped from Republican to Democrat. And so you do have the political backdrop of how does abortion play in these areas. And I think the vote on the constitutional amendment gave some indication of, where people are on the issue district by district. And those numbers are overwhelmingly were opposed to the amendment. And so, I think there's political implications that I think everybody's going to be weighing when these issues come up.
Okay.
So I think it's going to be a very different environment. I don't necessarily, like I said, I think we're sort of still kind of at the gossipy stage in terms of what's being considered. And I would hesitate to tell you it would be this bill or that bill. But I think the ramifications of, votes on that legislation are going to be in everybody's minds, given the vote that we had on August 2nd.
Okay. Thank you, Brad. Kansas Secretary of State Scott Schwab is once again on the hunt for a new Sedgwick County election commissioner. Whoever he picks will be the third person on the job in less than 2 years. You may remember last week we brought you news Sedgwick County Elections Commissioner Angela Caudillo was resigning. Secretary of State Scott Schwab appointed her to the position just last year after declining to renew Tabitha Lehman's appointment over a dispute with her on how she handled the 2020 elections while fighting cancer. The Kansas Reflector reports Lehman and her two predecessors combined served more than 4 decades in the post. Sedgwick County is one of 4 Kansas counties where the Secretary of State appoints the elections commissioner as opposed to voters electing them. The others are Johnson, Wyandotte, and Shawnee counties. A committee of representatives from Sedgwick County government and the Secretary of State's office will review applications and interview candidates. Then the committee will present Schwab with a list of finalists from which he'll choose the next commissioner. State law says the applicants must have lived in the county for at least 2 years, be a U.S. citizen at least 18 years old, and registered to vote. Preference will go to those with college degrees in business, public administration, or information technology. The county is looking for someone with at least 3 years management experience. So, Brad, I'm going to start with you. This is an issue that has raised some controversy statewide over the fact that we have these counties that don't get to elect their election commissioner.
There's been some debate about that in the past, and there's been efforts to, give local. I think in this issue there was some question about the fund. I think there have been some question about whether the funding was adequate, and there's always been kind of this, push and pull within some of those counties over either giving counties more control over the election officer's budget. And so that's been an issue that's been debated, but it's never gone anywhere. It hasn't been debated since that I can recall in at least 2 or 3 years. I don't know that this will bring that back. I think there are a lot of other issues that the legislature is dealing with, and this hasn't been an issue that's been considered in a while. But there's always been kind of that conflict over the election officer having more control, who has control over their budget, the county or the election officer. And so while the Secretary of State appoints them, the county has some control over how much money goes into the elections that are run there. I think in this case, in the not conversations, but the information that I've gotten from Sedgwick County is they believe that they have sufficiently funded that office, and they have provided information to show how much money they've spent over the last couple of years. So from their perspective, they believe that office had been funded adequately. This may be one of those cases too, where there's a lot of pressure on election commissioners these days. And there were a lot of allegations in terms of, election fraud and some of the things that we've heard.
Yeah, there were definitely some allegations made, some concerns about performance. I know from watching that office for several years now, it takes a little bit of time to grow into that position.
Well, I mean, looking at the 40 years between, I think it was Marilyn Chapman and Bill Gill, what were they doing so well that they were able to extend over administrations? So it wasn't about who was in that position. I'm talking about the Attorney General position, Secretary of State's position, to make that appointment. It was more about the performance of the persons that were in that position. So as a former county commissioner, I'm not privy to I'm not even privy to understanding if indeed they are funding that position, that office appropriately as it should be. I can't say that I know that, but my thoughts are that there's probably two issues. There's an issue of performance, and then there's an issue of funding. And I'm not sure who needs to get down to the bottom of it, if it's the county, because they're the ones that pay the bill, or if it's the individual that's appointing and making the decision as to who to place in that position.
Yeah.
But also, though, we do have a problem in that in Kansas right now, the Secretary of State who gets elected is almost always Republican and gets elected with a coalition that is strongest in the places where he or she is not appointing the election commissioners. And that is a constitutional issue that we should really face up to.
All right. And that's where we're going to have to leave it for today. Thank you both, Melanie and Neil, as well as Brad, for joining us. And thank you for watching. We'd also like to extend our thanks to our media partners at the Wichita Eagle, Cake News, and KSN News for sharing their materials with us. We'd like to end by asking your opinion for one of our final shows of the year. What do you think is the biggest story of 2022? Just email us your ideas at kansasweek@kpts.org. We'll share your answers right here on December 30th. For now, stay safe and have a great week.